Okay, thanks for joining us today for our next Newcastle Youth Study Centre online seminar. Today we're talking about gambling and the financialisation of everyday life, and we're joined by Ino, Alex, and Samuel. I'd like to start by acknowledging we're meeting in Newcastle on the lands of the Wabakal and Worimi people. That's where the campuses are in Newcastle, and pay respects to elders past, present, and future, and welcome any Indigenous peoples joining us online today. So we're going to get straight into it. Basically, the format is each speaker will have about 20 minutes to talk. We'll take a couple of questions from the attendees. For the attendees that can hear me at the moment, please put your questions into the Q&A, and I'll ask them there. So yeah, let's get straight into it. So over to you, Alex.
Worries. There we go. So hopefully that's all coming through okay. Slides all good?
Yep.
Good. Excellent. Okay. So hi, I'm Alex Russell from the Experimental Gambling Research Lab at Central Queensland Uni. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been observing over a few different studies recently. But, one of the things that comes out pretty loud and clear is that young men are often those who are most at risk for experiencing gambling harm. And we'll, draw on a few studies, see what comes through. Just a little bit of disclosure early on. Pretty much all of my funding comes from government funding bodies. Haven't had any industry funding in like the last 10 years, and we don't do that into the future or anything. And I don't have any conflicts to declare with any of these studies that we're talking about here. So a little bit about me as well, so you know who you're talking to. I'm an experimental psychologist. And I've been in gambling research for, God, a long time now. Started back in 2011. I'm a statsy sort of person, but often involved in mixed methods kind of studies as well. And always interested in chatting to anyone about anything, really, to be honest. So don't hesitate to reach out. I work in a team with a few people and want to give them a shout out as well. So we've got Matt Rockloff, Matt Brown, Nerily Hing, and myself there. We're sort of the core of the group. We've got Dr. Kathy Tullock, who's our postdoc as well. And then a few others, Georgia DeLosa, Brenton Williams, Susan Rouncevelle, some of our students or early postdocs there as well, and a few others that come in and out depending on the project that we're doing. So good team with a lot of experience, and want to acknowledge them because some of them have been involved in the work that we'll talk about today. So today I'm going to touch on a few things. We're going to talk about some of the recent prevalence studies that we've been doing, focus on the most recent one, the ACT one, but the findings are generally similar across them. I'll talk a little bit about why access to harmful products is interesting and different in Australia and what we can learn from it, and particularly social influence and how important that is amongst young men in particular. So let's jump in and talk about some facts and figures to start off with. So the ACT Gambling Survey is the most recent prevalence study that we've completed. There's a few more coming. So Tasmania is coming this year, and others as well. And these are really useful studies because we get a sense of what's happening in the communities, because the samples that we get from these are as close to representative as we can get. Representative samples are hard to get and expensive to get as well. So these kind of data are rare and useful to answer a lot of questions about what's happening. So let's start off with looking at different gambling forms and seeing what's been happening over time. So this is the fourth ACT prevalence study. And what these figures show, like the lighter purple bars are the older prevalence studies, and the darker ones are the more recent ones. And so we can see that like the most popular form of gambling here up the top is lotteries, followed by scratch tickets, pokies or EGMs, tend to come in about third. And we can see from pretty much all of them that fewer people are taking part over time. And this is a trend that we've seen across a lot of different prevalence studies, that fewer people are, or a lower proportion of the population is gambling. With the exception of sports betting, which is the only one that's sort of been picking up over the last little while. There are a few new ones that are coming on the market as well, things like betting on esports or fantasy sports, but they're pretty low prevalence. So we've got this picture of, lower proportion of people gambling over time. But when we have a look at problems, we sort of see a little bit of a different picture. Like amongst those who are still gambling, there's more people in any of the risk categories. So this is the problem gambling severity index here amongst people who gamble. And we can see that, there's the proportion of people in the low risk gambling category has more than doubled. Same with moderate risk, and problem gambling has about doubled as well. So we're calling this a bit of an intensification of problems here. Fewer people are gambling, but amongst those who are, there's more problems happening. So the people who are dropping off are the ones who were not gambling that much at all in the first place. So when we have a look at who's most likely to experience problems, I'm going to show you this figure and I'll talk you through it the first time. We'll show you a few more of these figures. It'll start to make sense after a little bit. What we have here is these are age lines. So the dark purple here is men, the light purple is women, and the dotted line in the middle is total sample. We did also have a small number of people who identified as other genders, not enough to make an age line for them, but we do have an overall prevalence figure over here for them as well. So what we can see is the line here is higher for men and particularly for young men. And this line indicates the proportion of the population who are classified in the moderate risk or problem gambling categories. So young men are the most likely to be experiencing problems. Let's see if we can work out why. If we have a look at harm, so we looked at harm separately from problems. They're kind of related ideas, but harm's a little different, a little more of a pure measure. We can do some really fancy analyses. And one of the things that we can actually do is look at the people who are experiencing harm, look at what they're gambling on and how often they're gambling on it, and attribute a certain amount of harm to different products. So when we do that, we can see that the most harmful products are pokies, EGMs, which probably won't surprise anyone. In the ACT, they're responsible for about a third of harm experienced by people who gamble at the population level, followed by wagering products, so that's sports and race betting, and casino table games. So these are the big ones. This number for pokies is a little smaller than what we see in some other states. So in New South Wales, it's about 50%. WA is a bit lower. I'm going to talk about that in a sec. But it gives you a sense. These are the products that are associated more with harm. So pokies, betting, and casino table games. And who's most likely to take part in them? Well, won't surprise you too much. It's young men. So here's EGMs. And about a third, or 3 in 10 men aged 18 to 24 gamble on the pokies, compared to about 18% of women. And you can see it really drops off as amongst older people. And it's the same for casino table games. Young men are most likely to take part. Sports betting, young men are most likely to take part. Race betting is a little bit of an older crowd, but young men are still up there in terms of being most likely to take part. So young men are experiencing the most harm at the population level because they're more likely to take part in these forms. Now, is it the case, the more harmful forms? So is it the case that they just gamble more on everything? Not really. So if we have a look at lotteries, they're not really associated with much harm at all, because most people tend to have a budgeted amount set aside. And it's not like you sit there at the newsagent buying lottery ticket after lottery ticket. It's not a very continuous form of gambling. And we can see that young people are actually the least likely to take part in this form, including young men down there. And when we look at things like scratchies and bingo, actually women are more likely to take part in these forms as well. So it's not just that young men gamble on anything, it's that they're particularly more likely to take part in the forms that are more harmful. Not only are they more likely to take part, they're more likely to lose a disproportionate amount of money. So this table here says that men aged 18 to 39 are about 22.6% of the total population. They account for about 36.1% of people who gamble on pokies, and they account for 40.4% of losses. So they're a little less than a quarter of the population, but they account for 40% of losses. When we take older men into account as well, men are losing more than 80% of losses on EGMs. And we see about the similar pattern for casino games and sports betting. Young men here account for about 70% of losses on sports betting and about 72% of losses on casino games, despite being 22.6% of the population. So it gives you a bit of a sense about, it's not just taking part, it's the fact that they're taking part at such high levels there. Um, this figure as well will show you just how much harm is associated with different groups. So this is amongst people who gamble. And this graph shows you combinations of age and gender and education as well, which we also see to be a bit of an important factor. So the bottom four rectangles here are men and the top four are women. The left four are people who are under 40 and the right four are people who are above 40. And then within each gender, the top two are people who have completed a bachelor's degree or higher, have completed tertiary education, and the bottom two are people who aren't. So each square is a unique combination of gender and age and education. And the idea is that the bigger they are and the darker they are, the more harm there is experienced by that segment. And we can see that the biggest ones are amongst the people who are under 40 and who are men, and particularly those who haven't completed tertiary education. So this is what it looks like for people who gamble. So this is not to downplay, women. Like younger women are far more likely to experience harm compared to older women, for example. There's still a lot of harm happening in these segments. But the big, core of it is amongst young men in particular. And when we compare this to people who are experiencing harm from someone else's gambling, we can see a bit of a gendered pattern emerges. Now it's women who, and particularly younger women, who are most likely to experience harm due to someone else's gambling. So what's going on? Well, one of the things is that we have a lot of access to very harmful products. Australia's a little bit unusual in that we have pokies in pubs and clubs, whereas in other countries across the world, they tend to be restricted to gambling-specific venues. So things like casinos, for example. So I'll just skip through that slide. There's one exception to this, which is Western Australia. So Western Australia has never really had pokies in pubs and clubs. They have all of their pokies in one place, the casino in Perth. So this gives us a sort of really interesting opportunity to have a look at a place where everything else is the same. Like online gambling is very much the same in Western Australia, but pokies are really different. If you want to use a pokey in WA, you really have to make an effort to get there. So what does that mean? What does it tell us in terms of if we restrict these really harmful products, what does it look like in terms of gambling behavior and gambling harm in Western Australia compared to the rest of the country where pokies are everywhere? So we ran this study and we found that in Western Australia, actually more people gamble. So 62.9% of people in Western Australia gamble, adults gamble, compared to 56% in the rest of Australia. But the biggest difference is on lotteries. And I sort of told you before, lotteries aren't that associated with harm. Whereas about half as many gamble on pokies because it's harder to get to. When you ask people about if they're experiencing any problems or, whether any problems they're experiencing is due to pokies, it's much lower. In fact, it's about 1/3 lower in terms of the proportion of people experiencing any problems amongst people who gamble, just because they don't have as much access to pokies. In addition, we sort of saw that people don't really move to other forms. So, there is maybe a question around whether people are just sort of predisposed to experiencing harm. Would they have experienced harm from something else if they didn't have access to pokies? And we didn't really see a shift to the other harmful forms so much. So things like casino games and wagering. So we haven't seen that substitution. And that's the thing that the industry sort of tells us to be worried about quite a bit, which is if we put more restrictions on pokies, people will just go online and the world will end and it'll be terrible. But we haven't seen that substitution at all. We did do some fancy statistics here to sort of see, all right, that harm and problems are 1/3 lower in Western Australia. How much of that can we attribute to the pokies? And actually, all of it. So that's the whole reason that harm is 1/3 lower in WA is because people have less access to EGMs. And Not only that, amongst people who do use EGMs the same amount, people who use pokies in WA the same amount as someone in New South Wales experience the same amount of harm. So pokies in WA are a little bit different. They don't have rotating reels, for example. The symbols just kind of turn on. So you don't see that one that you almost spun onto the reel and then bounced back, for example. You don't see some of those near misses. That doesn't make a difference. If you got access to a pokey is pretty much a pokey, and it'll you'll experience just as much harm. It's just that it's harder to get to. All right. So if we were to bring in some meaningful restrictions to harmful products, it has a pretty meaningful effect on harm, which is good. Question is, what are meaningful restrictions? And good way to think about it is anything that makes the industry unhappy is a meaningful restriction. So anything that you get a lot of pushback about is often a pretty good sign that you're heading in the right direction. All right. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how we're seeing products getting more dangerous as well. So let's have a look at sports betting, for example. One of the things that we've seen come in is the speeding up of sports betting. And the way I think about this is if you think of a pokey, every spin, which is about 2.5 to 3 seconds, is a bet. Whereas with sports betting, what you used to have to do was think of this as a timeline across the screen. Here's where the match starts, and here's where the match ends. What you used to have to do was place the bet before the match started, and you'd pretty much be betting on who was going to win and maybe by how much. So you'd have this big long gap, however long the match is, before you found out the outcome, right? Big long gap here. Over time, we've seen some other things come in, like you can bet on what's going to happen in the game, for example, like who's going to score first, or who's going to be ahead at half time, those sorts of things. So the gap's smaller between placing the bet and the outcome becoming known. Um, we see it the other way as well. There's a thing called live betting, which is where you can place bets after the match has started. And a lot of that originally was around the outcome of the game as well. So the idea was you might place a bet before the game and your team's not doing so well. So you place another bet during the game to try and offset your losses. Um, then the inevitable thing happened, being able to bet in the match on something that happens in the match. And we're really closing that gap between the bet being placed and the outcome becoming known. And now we've seen things where you can place a bet on something that's just about to happen, like the next point in tennis, for example. And so the time between betting the place and the outcome is so small, I can barely fit an arrow in there. Now, the only thing is, people don't just do one bet. They tend to do multiple of these bets, and it becomes much more like a pokey. So we're seeing this happen more and more. Now, it's not typically available in Australia, but maybe it is. The thing is, when you have a look at this type of betting, so we did a study on this a while ago, we see that those who take part in it are much more likely to experience problems. Those who take part in micro betting, about 78% of them are in the problem gambling category, and about 95% of them experience some degree of problems. So that's quite a lot. Now, I said it's not available in Australia. So, for example, in cricket, you can't bet on the next ball in Australia, but you can bet on the next over. And an over in cricket is just 6 balls, and that's only a few minutes. So it's not really that different. And that's a real challenge for legislators there in terms of drawing a line. So we're seeing, not just that young men are more likely to take part in more dangerous products, but products like sports betting are becoming more dangerous because they're, learning what works. And a lot of this, of course, is, targeted at young men. So I think I'm on 20 minutes there. I've got some stuff on social associations, but we can come back to it later if we want. So maybe I'll stop now and hand over for questions.
Thanks, Alex. That was really informative. Well, we've got one question. Maybe just you can provide some definitions for maybe people that aren't familiar with some of the concepts, particularly the
Mhm.
idea of gambling relating harm.
Yeah,
Maybe,
sure.
maybe unpack that a little, what it is, types, who can experience it, what does it mean,
Yep.
contextualize some of the kind of notions of harm for us.
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned that there's a difference between problems and harm. So let me start there. So problems is we use this thing called the problem gambling severity index. And the idea is it measures a few different things. And some of these things are potentially problematic behaviors, like chasing losses, like how frequently you go back the next day to try and win back what you lost. And it also, measures some things that are harms. So things like, feeling depressed because of your gambling, those sorts of things. So, um, problems are a bit of a fuzzy concept. Like the PGSI was developed back around, 99, and formally published in 2001. And it served us really well, but it is a bit of a fuzzy concept. So we've moved now to measuring harm a little more exclusively. And by harm, I mean we're not talking about the behaviors themselves. Like we're not so worried about chasing losses and things, at least in the measurement sense. We're measuring things like impacts on your life, like what happens due to gambling. So when we think about these harms, like the most obvious ones are things like financial harms. So, not being able to pay your bills or, that kind of thing. Big losses of money. But these things can also impact other areas of life, like your relationships, for example, your work or your study, even your physical and mental health, cultural issues. There's lots of different harms that can potentially come through. So we need to be a little careful though, because, you know, it's easy to think about these different harm categories and think that like they're really exclusive to each other. But really, most of it stems from time and money losses. So some people can afford to lose the money, but it's also the time that you spend on things that can get in the way of like family commitments, for example.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks. We've got a question from the audience. Hi, Alex. My country, Indonesia, is experiencing many citizens, youth and adults trapped in online gambling. The
Mhm.
government struggles to eradicate this online gambling, but the problem is that the server's platform is located overseas in
Yeah.
Cambodia. What suggestion do you have to overcome this case?
It's a really tricky one, but Australia might be sort of a helpful case there for this. So we've had the same issue. There is this concern around you've got all the companies that are licensed in Australia, and they can provide the products that the government wants them to, and nothing else to Australian citizens. But
Mm,
there are all these what we call offshore gambling companies, and they're not really, subject to the same restrictions. So I mentioned like micro betting, that bet after bet in sports type thing, is not meant to be available to Australians, but if you go onto an overseas website, then you can access it. And that's how a lot of the people in the study do.
yeah.
So what can we do about it? Well, about 2018, the Australian Communication and Media Authority put out a thing basically saying we're going to start cracking down on you for the overseas companies, and started blocking them. For example, like their websites, if you try and load them in Australia, won't work. That's a bit of a cat and mouse game because they can just start a new website, and a lot of them do, which is like a clone of the original, for example.
Mhm.
But they also worked with a lot of the more legitimate sort of providers to say, listen, you're not meant to, accept any bets from Australians. So they put in a lot of the legitimate companies put in measures like if they see you're coming from an Australian address, or if you're coming from um, your money is coming from an Australian bank account, then they will stop you betting and refund your money. So, working with the more legitimate ones has helped, but that just means it leaves the dodgy ones around to do it if they want.
Mm,
So it's a little bit of cracking down there and trying to work with governments in other countries. So that'll be a little bit about politics there as well, which is tricky. The flip side is consumer education because, there is no consumer protection around betting with these offshore sites. If they rip you off, like if an Australian wagering company rips me off, I can go and, to consumer protection
yeah.
places. But with offshore ones, you can't.
Mm.
So is it worth the risk? And getting those messages out there is another potential way of working on it.
Okay, that's great. That's a really good answer. Thanks. I think if I can ask you one more question before we
Mhm.
move on to Ano's presentation. So yeah, I went to a great conference that you organised earlier in the year, and as a kind of nascent gambling researcher, it was interesting to find out, for instance, that governments, sorry, the industry kind of are kind of up for some kinds of regulation more so than others, and they kind of
Yeah.
almost like the focus on like the idea of the problem gambler, and because it kind of allows them to kind of really fly under the radar for many other things they're doing. So can you
Mm.
maybe just kind of explain a little bit about, the orientation towards regulation that the industry has?
Yeah, look, it's sort of an interesting one. Yeah, so there's been a shift over time in the way that the industry is expected to work.
Hmm.
So if you go back long enough, the core idea was that people just had to look after themselves. So a buyer beware type approach, where, if you gambled too much, that was your fault. You shouldn't have done that. And the bookies can, just do whatever they wanted to do, basically. Over time, things like responsible gambling type messaging came in, which was along the lines of, "Hey, look, you still have to do the right thing as a consumer. You have to be responsible, but maybe we'll give you a little bit of information about how products work and things to help you make informed decisions." Um, that's still very much putting the blame on individuals for harm that they experience, and still gives the industry a bit of a free pass in terms of what they do. And we've seen that over time a lot of industry people have acted pretty poorly, and actively targeted people who experience problems because they make about like 40 to 60% of their profit from about 1 to 3% of consumers.
Yeah.
Right, all these, which are all the ones who experience problems.
Yeah.
So we've moved more to, a stronger regulation kind of approach, which is, working with industry to get them to, be a bit more proactive in terms of heading off harm. Um, Long way to go
Yeah.
on that, I would say. But industry is happy to bring in certain things. Like, for example, there's a thing that we have here called the National Self-Exclusion Register, which is where previously, before that came in about 2020 or so, um, uh, if you wanted to stop yourself being able to bet from betting companies online, you had to go to everyone that you had an account with, and self-exclude from each one.
Hmm.
And most people who experience problems had accounts with many of those places. Uh, what's happened now is you just go to one place and self-exclude, and the gambling companies check in on that essentially and find that you're not able to bet. So they kind of like that. My understanding, anyway, is that they kind of like that approach because it's not up to them to make the decision, right?
Yeah.
The decision is made for them, the rules set. If there's some problem with the register, right, that's run by ACMA, that's not their problem. Whereas if there's a problem with their own self-exclusion register, they can get in a lot of trouble for that. So, industry is happy to work in with some things, but as soon as we're talking, like really meaningful restrictions,
Yeah.
we'll hear a lot of kicking and screaming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. I'll get you
All
to
good.
stop sharing your screen so we can go to ANO's presentation now. You right to share your screen there?
Thank you. All right, let's see if I can do this again. Yes. Are you on?
Nope.
No. Hold on. No, I need to click.
That's it. There
Oh,
we go.
we're in. Hi.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to get started? Thanks.
I'm going to get started. So, hi, I'm Aina Swami. I can see it. I've given myself a new surname in my little screen, which is way cooler than my own. But yeah, I'm the director of the ANU Centre for Gambling Research, and I'm calling in from the Ngambri and Ngunnawal lands here in the ACT in Canberra. And I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm really pleased that Alex was presenting before me because he gave a really good kind of overview what's happening in Australia and what's gambling harm, what does it look like. I'm gonna be focusing on a study that we finished in 2024. So this bigger report is published on this, and I'm happy to send it to people. Oh, it's publicly available if you just Google it. But we've been doing some reanalysis of the data around young people's experience transitions to online gambling. So I'm focusing on very qualitative data on young people here in the ACT. And this paper is currently under review hopefully will be published later this year. And I'll go and do my, hold on, why can't I click this? So this is my conflict of interest statement, and I'm not expecting you to read all of it, but I guess the last bit matters. I've never received direct funding from the gambling industry, and a little bit actually about us. So we are a small centre. We've been here in the ANU almost 25 years now, so one of the longest standing specialised gambling research centres. We do a lot of work for the ACT government, but we also work with the federal government around online gambling and kind of use national population-based data sets to inform policy. But the main aim of the centre is to do work that prevents gambling harm across different population groups. So that's kind of us in a nutshell. So now that most of our lives are moving online, it's no surprise that gambling is also moving to online formats. And legal, I think Alex touched upon this a little bit, but the main forms of online gambling that are legal are lotteries, then sports betting, races betting. There's some new forms like betting on esports and fantasy sports as well. Online gambling, the participation has been increasing pretty steadily for the last 10, 15 years, but there was a bit of a stark increase over COVID. So in 2024, according to our national data, the online forms have surpassed now the venue-based forms, and it is mainly driven by lottery tickets being bought online, but also sports betting, which is rapidly increasing. It's one of the fastest moving markets in Australia in the online space. Now, of course, children are not legally allowed to gamble, but they do. So there's quite a bit of evidence now, and they do access these sites that are only meant for adults, but also there's a lot of informal gambling, like footy tipping with mates, private gambling as well. There's a big market for the offshore gambling industry as well, like those pokies and casino type of online gambling platforms that are not legal in Australia. There's now also lots of gambling features in video games that are not regulated as gambling, and they're very readily available for children, but they are psychologically like gambling, and you can spend a lot of money in them, and kind of those addictive features as well. Overall, young people, when you're looking at populations in Australia and elsewhere, young people are less likely to gamble. But when they gamble, they're more likely to gamble online. They're also more likely to experience harms from their gambling. So there's this notion of gamification that we've been really interested in, which means in kind of lay terms that things like games, sports that are not initially kind of built for gambling activity, they're now being gamified. So there's these gambling features so in video games, for example, this looks like these loot box features that are like little poker machines that are randomly being dropped in your game during the gameplay. There's also betting on the outcomes of video games called esports betting. In sports, so traditional sports, there's lots of obviously gambling advertising, but then this normalization of the lingo, like using odds. So when young boys and girls are talking about their favorite teams, they're talking about their outcomes in terms of odds, and betting becomes really kind of infiltrated into the context where young people they play the games that they love. And this gamification, it's being conceptualized as blurring the boundary between gambling and gaming. But then there's also some research evidence that might act as a gateway to further kind of more serious gambling, but also gambling harm as an adult if you participate in these activities as a child. And on that, so participation in sports and video games has been also recognized as a risk factor for gambling as an adult and gambling harm. So this brings me to the rationale of this analysis that we did with the data. So if this normal kind of proactive things that kids do and can be good for them, video games and sports, if they are being identified as a risk factor for gambling and gambling harm, why is that? And there's a bit of research into this. There's no clear consensus what the mechanisms are. And there's, obviously individual factors, environmental factors, structural factors, kind of design features in these games as well. So we wanted to understand what the young people's own lived experience was around this. How did they understand, the move from not gambling, but participating in these games, to gambling? And we spoke to 40 young people here in the ACT, and the recruitment, we had a pretty broad inclusion criteria. So just recruiting regular individuals who regularly gambled online in the last 12 months and gambled online in specifically. And this gambling online could be video game gambling. It could be just normal sports betting. They were all adults, so they had turned 18 years of age. Those of you who know ACT, it's a pretty small jurisdiction. So getting 40 young people to talk to us was a really bit of an effort. So we did lots of social media advertising, but also advertising university campus here, also at the kind of secondary schools event as well, and the local TAFE as well, CIT. We got few young women as well, which was great. We had some pink leaflets. I don't know if that helped. I was laughing about them when I saw them, but didn't want to be genderist, but we really wanted to understand kind of the broad range of experiences of these young adults. So the data looks, we really just wanted to understand the journey. So we used this retrospective method of kind of asking the young people's own views on, when did you start gambling? How did that happen? What were the key influences? But really letting the young people tell their own stories, and then we might have had few prompts. So basically how they went from no gambling to gambling, and what's their journey along the way. We did some deductive organization of the topics first that are more based on the interview questions, and then went into generating these inductive themes and creating a bit of a pathway model based on these themes as well. But I'll just jump into the data now. So the first theme that really came through these young people when they started talking about the start of their gambling journey was the love of the games. So they loved their sports. They loved the video games. They're really drawn into the immersion of the world, so the kind of technical skills that the sports required, and they might have been playing themselves, the sports, or they've been watching it, or they might be playing the video games or watching them. And it was just very obvious that they started playing these games without the intention of any gambling or even a lot of information about gambling. Then, hold on, I'm just going to try and move. There's some things on the way on the screen. So then after some time, once they had, and a lot of these young women and men, they started engaging with the video games and the sports in primary school, maybe when they were 10, 12 years old. And then after some time, these gambling features, they just became completely inescapable in the game. So they could have been in the video games. They were more to do with the game design. There were, you couldn't access the next character. You couldn't go through a level unless you purchased a loot box. Same thing with, so kind of sports, being interested in sports, like you couldn't kind of talk about the next game or the game you're going to watch on the weekend without talking about bets and odds and so on. And advertising was a very, very big influence from very early on through the video game platforms as well as the the sports participation and watching sports as well. The esports platform was interesting. There was lots of mentions by those who played video games. So in video games, they could purchase loot boxes, but then in loot boxes, you get these items out of them, and you could sometimes go and trade or sell or purchase new ones on these third-party platforms that were kind of semi-legal. But through these third-party platforms, then participants were describing that they were completely exposed to all these gambling advertising, but also linking them to gamble on these illegal offshore sites on esports betting. So there's these different layers of like gambling, getting the outcome, and then going on these websites. But then you can also gamble with the outputs from the loot boxes, like skins or weapons, and bet on these esports tournaments. So it was completely immersed in this kind of complexity of different gambling features as well. After being then exposed to this and participating in gambling in these games, then the participants were talking about this excitement and the thrill. And you can imagine these games that these young women and men, they loved. And then they got this added excitement on these games that they really loved. It was like, you can see in these quotes how exciting it was. So it added on the engagement of the game. You could just entertain yourself for hours. So it was drawing them even more into this kind of gambling space instead of just the game space. And this young woman who's describing the excitement around, when you're still expecting that the chances are ridiculously low and you get something really rare. So it's really kind of the gambling, similar to like the anticipation of getting something, a big win from a poker machine. And then finally, for some of these participants, they weren't all at this stage, whereas they were all pretty much describing these three: love of the game, gambling inescapable, and then the thrill. But then some got to this point where gambling became the distinct focus. So instead of the game that they loved, it was the gambling that they became to love, and it was the focus rather than. And then these young men and women, they weren't really talking about their own problems or harms, and the harms weren't really the focus of this research either, but they were often talking about their mates when they're talking about the harms. So the harms would look like, well, instead of us talking about the game, he just goes on his phone and doesn't even talk to me. Whereas we used to just chat about the game before and after, and now it's just about the bet and not about the game. And then at this point, often there were mentions about the financial rewards as well, because that was never mentioned before. It wasn't even the gambling. It was more about the thrill. It was more about that they couldn't escape it, and then the excitement. But at this point, it then became the focus. So I'm like, oh, okay, I can actually make money of it. They often thought, which is obviously not the case. You lose more than you bet. And yeah, and that was kind of the climax, if you like, them describing like where they come on that journey. So using this visual as a summary, I'll just go through summarizing the findings from this analysis. So the young people, so they first started playing these games at their lab. They didn't set out to gamble. And then because of this kind of infiltration of advertising and design features, then they couldn't escape the gambling. And it was also seen as very normal and proactive. And, you don't have problems when you gamble. You just do it for the thrill and for the fun. It's very leisurely, like you've seen all those gambling advertisements. And then it became this thrill. And then finally, for some, it was not the game that they loved, it was the gambling, and that could have potentially for some of them it did lead to pretty serious harms, psychological harms, as well as financial and interpersonal harms. So I'm going with time. Yep, good.
Yeah, good. We've got like another 5 minutes, really.
Excellent. So I'll just talk about a couple of key findings, what I think are the key findings. I'm curious to learn what you think. Please try again. Sorry, my phone's going. So first of all, what we see here is not an intentional uptake of gambling of these young people, which is what we often hear in terms of like, oh, these young people just want to access, and it's this immersion. So the young women and men, they just wanted to engage with these pretty healthy activities otherwise that, can benefit them in many ways. But what we saw in the data was this clear progression from exposure and then curiosity and almost like forced exposure, and then going to experimentation and then regular participation, which became a bit problematic for some of them. And the key drivers of these transitions, if you like, within the pathway were really the peer influence, but also the advertising and the kind of the game design environment. And then for some, the thrill really led into the gambling becoming more of a focus. And then the other kind of take-home message for us was that it's not just about the individual. It's not about the individual factors. It's about the structure and social environments shaping the access and also the norms around what's good, what's normal and what's acceptable as well. And having this very unregulated kind of gambling advertising and lack of regulation it sends a message to these young people, particularly. It sends a message to everyone, but it sends a message to young people who are more vulnerable. And we see now gambling's just embedded in all the environments that young people are, and because of these online platforms, and it's not a new thing, but I guess my final kind of comment here would be that gambling is inescapable, and it has been, for decades now, but also it's become it happens earlier, it happens quicker, and kids are younger because of these online platforms as well. I'm nearly done, but as I said, where will we go next? Because I always need the so what of research. So what? So obviously we don't have a very strong federal government at the moment. You might have heard Prime Minister handing down a response to some recommendations that were tabled in the Parliament almost 2-3 years ago. Some years ago now, we've been waiting for the government's response, and those recommendations, they had complete ban on gambling advertising, and now the announcements are more around tinkering around the edges. There's no strong national leadership. So we need to do something in terms of trying to protect our communities. So what we do, we then, educate young people. We need to educate parents because the kids are getting younger and younger in this space, and we need to understand what's happening online, what the kids are exposed to. We also need to really harness the kind of caring strategies that young people already have, which became through really clearly. I didn't have time to talk about that in this presentation, but that was really, especially there's these like groups of young men go like, all right, well, we're going to do this and this and before we even put on a bet, and they put budgets in place, or if they're university or school, they're like, we need to finish schoolwork before we game on this, do an all-nighter or something. They're not going to stop participating, but what are the safe practices and what are they already doing? I'm going to stop talking because I think it's my time, but we got more money from the ACT government after this to do a co-design with young people. If you're interested in seeing what there is, so we got resources for parents, kids, as well as young adults. Go and have a look. The website is well and truly live. And any questions?
That was great. Thanks, Sana. And yeah, I've had a look around the website. It's really useful, and I think people will be able to get a lot of useful things for their own lives out of that, and particularly for educating their kids. It looks great. Um, so we have a question in here from Alex actually, kind of pointing out there's a bunch of different types of kind of gambling-like games. Things like loot boxes are different to kind of social casinos, and for example, um, do you have any kind of thing to say about those differences and what they mean and how they maybe affect some of the things you're talking about?
Absolutely. And if I had another 20 minutes, I would have gone through all the different
Yeah.
kind of types. So I guess the main types. So we got the loot boxes that sit within the games. They like the poker machines in the games. Then there's social casinos that are, might be somewhere within the game. You're watching other people gamble. You don't do anything, or you might click through things, and there's different versions of it. But it's mainly watching and being exposed
Mm,
to that kind of casino playing or playing poker within games. And even within that, there's different subtypes. And of course, then there's the esports where gambling comes in that you put bets on the outcomes of these games. There's big
yep.
tournaments. It's more like sports betting. It's like, oh, which team is going to win or which individual is going to, if they're just single player games. And there's probably other subtypes I'm not thinking about now, but and this makes it really difficult for parents and for young kids to understand what is it that I'm looking at? Is it something I'm participating in, or is it something I'm using money on? Is it something that I have to do, or is it and the way it affects your brain? Because all those things affect your brain. And there's now the classification board, I think they're drilling down into it, like in a really, really like a evidence-based good way. But so they put different kind of age recommendations for these for games with different gambling features. But unless they are R-rated, like loot boxes are MA, I think, it's up to the parents to enforce the rules. So they're not legally enforceable, though there's lots of loopholes and a lot
Mm.
of kids of 10 years of age still do loot box games if their parents are okay with it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and it's interesting. Like I'm involved in sport, and like it's been interesting over the past 10 or 15 years. Watching, in lower grade cricket, for instance, 14-year-old kids come into the dressing room like knowing about the odds on games, and the kind of also then playing these games on their phones in front of us. It's very much become ubiquitous really quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things that was in your one of the slides there when people were talking about it was like the embodied kind of emotional experience of this, right? Which is interesting comparing to kind of apparently the very rational idea of like understanding what finances is meant and money is meant to be. Can you talk a little bit about the connection between those things?
So I don't know if I get this right, because that it's not the kind of I know what you mean. I think I know which quote you mean. It's
Yeah.
so these young people, they almost know that some of these like gambling is wrong and that it's risky and it's problematic, but they still want to do it because of this bodily experience
Mm,
and the risk taking. And that's the way the young brain is geared, as we know, and for whatever reasons. And that's why we're not going to stop young people because they still want that bodily
mm.
experience and what comes from the risk taking. And that's why kind of public health approach that goes, this is wrong. Do you have a problem? Can you recognize are you using too much money on this?
Yeah.
And blah, blah, blah. They actually don't help because of that. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does.
But
I mean,
that's
I
my
think,
take on kind of that aspect of it, which is really
yeah,
interesting.
the research we've done, and our research generally with young people find that kind of orientation towards them just doesn't work. And
Yeah.
it doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of there's like literally billions of dollars being spent on trying to get them into these things and the idea that and they've become like part of everyday life. So the idea that you just stop, just like, you just stop using social media and your mental health will be fine.
Yep.
Um, there's a similar thing. So yeah, I'm interested, I suppose, and I'm kind of segueing here towards another question is that like there's a lot of concern about parents worried about, what young people are up to on their screens generally and like, whether it's gambling or porn or bullying and all that kind of stuff. Do you think there needs to be kind of maybe broader? or what are there possibilities for broader general guidelines that aren't necessarily about gambling that kind of can address some of these issues?
Absolutely. And I think the way things are, and we are so experiencing the way things are funded now. There's like e-safety commission and commission, they're doing something amazing. But then again, because we are doing something on gambling, then they kind of just like scratch the surface. But
Mm,
I think it's a product of like weak leadership in terms of
yeah,
not dealing with the harms and how, and these are the same kids doing all these things
yep,
online. And they are also the kids who may not get supports from home or maybe have more propensity for risk-taking behaviors or all sorts of different reasons and subtypes there are. But we need something that I can just, I'm a busy parent. I've got a 10-year-old. I don't want to just like look at the screen that they using at all times. I want to be able to go, okay, well, okay, this is a problem. These are the things that we can do and moderate.
yeah,
It would be excellent for like just as a researcher, but as a parent.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I know I might get you to stop sharing so Sam can set his up now and we'll hear from him.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Hold on.
Just down the
Yeah.
bottom.
Thank you. Go
Sam,
for
you
it.
want to see if you can share now?
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I just couldn't do it at the same time.
Yeah.
One sec. Thanks, Aino. Thanks, Steve. Um, okay, just bring myself back to the start. I also have lots of, semi-anecdotal observations on social media and gambling that, for those of you I've met, I've probably already relayed, but um, which I find extraordinary and terrifying. The way that particularly the offshore operators that are really directly targeting children. But as I say, very anecdotal. Right. Hello, everybody. So my name's Sam. I'm from University of Bristol. I'm part of the Bristol Hub for Gambling Harms Research, which is a hub that's been running for a few years, just coming to an end at the moment. I'm going to be talking more on the financialization side, the financialization of everyday life, how it relates to gambling. And actually, a lot of my talk is going to be background in terms of finance or everyday finance and debt. And then some of the ways that I see that as relating to gambling and to gambling regulation. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly introduce my book that's hopefully, fingers crossed, coming out at the end of this year. I've got a picture of Gary Becker as the kind of architect of financial approach to thinking about crime and criminal justice. The focus of the book is predominantly upon trying to get criminology to take people's actual everyday financial experiences, meanings people assign to money seriously, which is something traditionally criminology hasn't done very well. But I also think this approach to as I say, taking money seriously can also offer a different approach to thinking about gambling and its relationship with the state. Have I put that? I had thought I had that as a final point. I don't. It's later on. So I think that the existing approaches within criminology, they miss out the extent to which cashless technologies are transforming the kind of raw material or the key subjects of criminology, namely surveillance. I'm just going to move. I'm just going to move my images because I can't see my words. Right, there we go. That's better. How they're changing the kind of key subjects of criminology, namely surveillance, punishment, behavioral control, and power. I think criminology tends to have not understood illicit monies in terms of how people organize the money that they gain from illicit activities such as drug dealing or theft, how those relate to their other monies from wage labor or from welfare benefits. So I'm trying to, based upon my own work and on ethnographic work in other areas, think about how we can take seriously the economic financial dynamics of people's everyday lives and how that leads them into, on the one hand, criminal actions, but on the other, gambling. So, as I say, there's going to be quite a lot of context because I want to set out the specific dynamics, particularly of debt, that I think are really important for understanding why, outside of the hyper-liberalisation of gambling in the UK, that's similar but different to Australia, why the industry has been able to have the impact that it has. And I think that raises important questions for why it's been so it has been regulated, but been under-regulated in the United Kingdom. And I'm going to finish on some more speculative questions around the relationships between debt, gambling, and power. So this, I'm going to bring together lots of different projects. And as you can see, I have a declaration as well concerning my recent project. So it brings together initially around a decade of work with advice services. So I have an ongoing research relationships, particularly with the Citizens Advice Service in the UK, but also with debt advice services as well. But more recently, I've been doing this work on gambling, which has been funded by the Bristol Hub for Gambling Harms Research. This is my declaration that we developed for the Hub, stating that we are independent of industry. Or the Hub is independent of any industry influence. So some context on debt. So I say between this period, I was working with Citizens Advice Service, previously Citizens Advice Bureau. I know there's a version of Citizens Advice in Australia, but it doesn't have the same role and impact that the service does in the UK. The context for this period is, as I'm sure you know, the raft of changes in public policy that we bring together under the term austerity. Broadly particularly cuts to local authority funding and welfare benefits. I'm going to go through a few of those in a moment, but just to note that term austerity really masks the really profound kind of more neo-paternalist restructuring of welfare that took place in this period. So I've got the kind of two key architects of these changes, George Osborne representing the more neoliberal, aggressive stripping back of public spending, and Ian Duncan Smith on the neo-paternalist side, really, articulating this idea that the state needed to take a much stronger view or make a much stronger role in telling people how to live their lives. So I'll quickly go through the raft of fairly catastrophic changes that the coalition government enacted between 2010 and 2015. There's a benefits cap, benefits freeze, a really aggressive expansion of conditionality, a limit on the number of children that could be claimed under the oral tax credit scheme under universal credit. That's actually very recently been revoked. But the key change that I focus on that hasn't been discussed nearly enough is the extremely aggressive approach to overpayment enforcement that was implemented at this time. Scarlett Wilcock in Australia talks about something similar in the Australian context. But what the new teams in the Department for Work and Pensions did was be far more aggressive about the debts that they were going to recoup from claimants and how they were going to enforce them. And the result was that you have large numbers of people living with deductions. So deductions from their benefits, meaning they've got far less to live on. And deductions kind of different to other forms of enforcement because you don't have any choice about it. It's already been deducted from your income. So the results of all of these changes is that you have a far greater proportion of the population who are dealing with what we term priority debts. So those are debts where if you fail to make a repayment, you have priority consequences, and those are principally loss of your home, loss of essential services, so gas and electricity, and loss of liberty. Liberty is very, very rare. It is in theory in place, but really we're talking about the first two, and particularly loss of home. So we've got large numbers of people living with priority debt repayments, so schedules of debt repayment, where if you miss one of those repayments, the consequences are extremely serious. Past those priority consequences, the other one, Ryan Davey talks about this particularly, is loss of children. So when life is really spiraling apart, there's the constant fear that social services will intervene and remove your children. So the first is this shift towards priority debts, and the second really, really significant shift over this period is the rise in what we call negative budgets. So that's people presenting to an advice service for the service, there is no amount of work they can do to make them have a balanced budget because their welfare payments are too low or their income is too low to ever meet their outgoings. And that's far worse now, as we know, with increased cost of living. So you've got a larger proportion of people, and this is a chart just showing the number of people coming into Citizens Advice with a negative budget rising over that period. Again, this is continuing to rise, for whom they will never have a balanced budget. this means that you've got lots of people living with priority debt repayment schedules who need credit in order to meet their essential outgoings. So there's no sense anymore that you are aiming towards getting a stable life. Your life is only about fending off the impacts of debt enforcement. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Gambling context, so much like Australia, although as you know, slightly different trajectory. We didn't have the scale of EGMs that Australia did in the 1990s. That's been more recent. But we've particularly been on a journey of liberalisation since the 2005 Gambling Act, and that was presaged by New Labour, a white paper put out in 2002. But in a similar fashion, that the approach from 2005 onwards has been upon responsibilising the individual customer. Regulation has been enforced by the newly created, as of 2005, Gambling Commission. So it's the Gambling Commission that sets and enforces our regulatory structure, which is set out in the licensing conditions and codes of practice. And part of that I'm particularly interested in is the social responsibility code. We had some changes introduced in terms of EGMs in 2019 in terms of stake limits. That's the impact of that has been a shift to other forms of games that those machines provide. As Alex mentioned earlier, we don't have anything like the prevalence of EGMs in bars and clubs, or we do, but in a different way. Really, we're talking about betting shops and increasingly high street casinos, which are regulated in slightly different ways. We're also, in similar fashion, kind of world leader in sophistication, penetration of online platforms. I think it was in you had 365 on your image of so 365, Entain, Flutter are significant exporters of products to other jurisdictions. There's been a series of stories about 365 and Chinese customers, for example. I do think we need to consider this beyond the domestic frame. I'm not going to talk about that now, but I do think it's important to take into account. So just to start off this discussion of the relationship between gambling and debt. So there are primarily two ways to approach this. And the first is on the right. And actually, I think this is from, I don't have a reference for this, with apologies. But the first is obviously to recognize the amount of people who have problem or other gambling issues who get into debt as a result. And clearly there's a correlation between the two. The other is this is a one of my participants from a few years ago talking about when they were in a really difficult debt situation, and this is them reflecting on it, having been through the advice process and being very positive about the advice process, that one of their ways of kind of retreating from that debt issue was just to play bingo, to throw huge amounts of money away on bingo because their financial life was so disastrous because of how they were experiencing their debt repayments. They also had lots of issues with enforcement agents and bailiff visits that were really having a catastrophic effect upon their everyday life. And she's describing something quite different, which is gambling as a retreat from the everyday experience of debt. So, and this is part of the theme that I want to explore. So a lot of the work written on debt in this period that I'm talking about, as I say, notable exception, Ryan Davey, there are others as well, is the tendency to believe or to describe the everyday life of being in debt as being determined by the disciplinary demands of creditors. So Lazzarato's two books, which are brilliant, but very much present life in debt in these terms as if people's lives are fully determined by the enforcement demands of their creditors. And Lazzarato positions this as the kind of central form of power in our current neoliberal era is organized around the creditor-debtor relationship. And there's a lot of truth to that in people's lives. But what I want to challenge is the idea that that's fully exhaustive, that that's all life is. Because what it really fails to represent is the way that people draw on consumer credit and also gambling to, at least momentarily, escape that imaginary of a life that is purely determined by debt repayments. And one of my things that's always struck me in this respect is that there are two industries. I'm going to come back to this. I'll come back to this slide, but there are two industries that understand extremely well the need for people who are in these cycles of debt repayment, the need for them to articulate some belief or dream that there is a life beyond that. And one obviously is consumer credit. Bright House now defunct, but Bright House advertising was very much based on this idea: you don't have anything, it's very difficult for you to have home entertainment or other consumer products that might make your life enjoyable, but we make that easy for you. And they're defunct due to more aggressive regulatory action on the part of our Financial Conduct Authority, and the other obviously is gambling. And you note, really similar strategies of advertising in both industries, appealing to the sense that your life is ordinary, there is nothing to believe in, there's no way for you to imagine a life beyond fixed debt repayments. We're giving you that. We're going to offer you a moment where it's not ordinary. So that's obviously 365, major sports betting operator, and then Gala, one of our big bingo operators who you'll know very well if you watch daytime television in the UK. So the approach we're taking, this is myself and my co-author colleague Joe Large, builds upon the approaches to gambling practice, particularly from feminist cultural economy. Put Kate Bedford's book, Bingo Capitalism, which is fantastic, but also Fiona Nicol, Emma Casey, and Gerda Reith, emphasizing the cultural embeddedness of gambling practices and gambling harms. We've currently got a bid in with the ESRC looking at the technological implementation of harm reduction measures. My particular interest in that is on affordability rules. And what the impact will be of using various forms of data for affordability checks. So I'm going to present some findings from I should have noted, how am I doing for time, Steve?
Yeah, about 5 more minutes.
5 minutes, great. So I'll present some findings from our betting shops project and then finish on some questions around power. So we've been doing work on regulation of in-person betting in betting shops, and particularly around the expectations upon staff to be intervening where they identify problem gambling, which is, as I say, implemented in the Social Responsibility Code as part of the licensing conditions. And the key points we want to raise from this work is, first of all, the impact of machines from 2009 or so onwards. And you might know Rebecca Cassidy's fantastic book, which recounts this as well. But it was such a dominant theme for anyone who'd been in the industry for a while to recognize how much the social and embodied space of the betting shop had been completely transformed by fixed odds betting terminals. As I say, those are B2 machines, slightly switched over to B3 machines now. But what those machines do is create a gambling space that kind of locks out any staff members and creates, maybe from Natasha Dalshaw's work, because you'll know, a kind of space between the gambler and the machine that is itself generative of anger, violence, and frustration, and makes it extremely difficult and highly dangerous for staff to intervene, which they're increasingly being expected to do. A second is that staff found making these in-person affordability checks extremely challenging. We had some quite colourful descriptions of this for why it's a terrible idea, but effectively staff were saying it's very, very difficult, particularly when you already have relationships with customers, to start asking them how much money they're making and whether they're actually rich enough to be able to afford to lose the money that they're making. And this is one staff member saying that actually it breaks the relationship that we're seeking to create with customers, which are, at least for those who took this seriously, about trying to reduce harm, that in effect, when you start asking them how rich they are, you're losing that connection that might otherwise be used to address their problem gambling. Yeah, sorry. The really key one really is that staff, particularly when they were single manning, so that's when they're being expected to run a shop on their own, found it extremely difficult to step out from behind the screen to be intervening where they identified problem gambling, particularly when the operator was expecting them to be taking bets, because that's a disciplinary offence in itself, not to be taking bets when you should be, particularly in a busy time. And they were saying that ultimately, you've got this tension where you're expected to be doing this harm reduction work whilst also be taking you got this operator demand to be taking bets. And finally, that CCTV wasn't always, which is increasingly obviously being implemented, and was experienced by staff as being an attempt to check upon their taking bets rather than a safety measure. This is, sorry, on the left, I've got Tom Lamont's article in The Guardian from 10 years ago, which is an indication of the dangers and stresses of single manning. So we frame this in terms of regulatory labour, of the way in which what's happened with these attempts by the Commission to, force staff to intervene into cases of gambling harm is enabling operators to offset or offload the risk of gambling harm onto their, increasingly poorly paid, precaritized staff members. So not necessarily that they embrace those regulatory interventions, but certainly that they've been useful for them in placing that risk onto their lowest paid employees. And certainly it's one of our key arguments that shouldn't be possible. There has to be a focus on products rather than on the most vulnerable staff members to be enforcing rules around gambling harm. So just in my last minute, we mentioned problem gamblers earlier. I just want to call it because I've built a lot on Fiona Nichols' work in this respect, making the argument that the problem gambler is sort of useful in an era of neoliberal financialization because it kind of forms the negative image of the disciplined financial subject. And I certainly think there's a truth to that in the context of debt and financialization, when people are living lives where there's this constant injunction to be speculating, and I think it's on my next slide, in terms of this financialization of every life, this injunction to reorient every moment, every relationship into an opportunity for leveraging resources to gain credit. Got another advert from The Guardian about leverage and investment. I think my argument would be in terms of financial subjectivity and power, that what happens with the promotion of gambling as a form of speculation in everyday life is that it's a way to make sure that the poor take responsibility for their failed speculations. And I realize I've run out of time, and I've put there's quite a lot going on there, and I put it very briefly. So I'm happy to talk about it more, but I'm drawn to that idea that what happens with this relentless, aggressive promotion of gambling into everyday life is that it's a way of making sure that people bear the burdens through increased debts, through increased anxiety and stress of their failed speculations in a way that doesn't happen in other sectors of particularly high value speculation. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. So yeah, that was great. We have a couple of questions from both the audience and our panelists, so I'll start through them now. So Rowan asks, thanks for the presentation. I'm curious about the betting shops you mentioned and whether they remain quite popular in the UK. In Australia, it seems like the independent TAB betting shops are becoming less popular, but the TABs have kind of made their way into pub spaces instead. Like, we kind of have those betting areas now in a lot of pubs, leading to lots of pubs and hotels having increasingly digitized and integrated betting shops areas within them. Wonder if this is a similar thing happening in the UK. Yeah, so I mean, the thing you call betting shops is very different to our kind of gambling shops here because they're actually full of machines and stuff, aren't they?
They're limited to four. Being in betting shops, they're not that dissimilar actually. I mean, they have changed. So to Alex mentioned earlier on, regulation that the operators oppose is generally a good thing. The stake limit was really heavily on fixed odds betting terminals was really heavily opposed.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the results of that has been the growth of the high street casino, which was not unknown, but not so common as it is now. So we're seeing something which betting shops are still very common, and they're still gaining a large proportion of their income from their machines. But since the introduction of stake limits in 2019, there's been slightly less of the that kind of momentum is shifting a bit towards the high street casinos, but they're still common and popular and
Yeah.
and very, very controversial, particularly as they're clustered in low income areas.
Yeah. Barry Shannon has a question for you. The casino here is right across the river from Adelaide Oval. This is in Adelaide, and I've always find myself there after the footy and cricket games while I wait for the car park to clear out. Lately, I'm noticing more groups of very young men playing pokies on the tables and on tables who appear to be performing a very specific and consistent masculine script in the way they behave, speak, and interact, and in the risks they take as they play, large bets, gambling, pokey wins, etc. There are also pokey influencers popping up on Instagram and Facebook, as well that target young men to engage in risky gambling. Some taking subscriptions and promising to donate profits to, for example, men's mental health. I wonder if you can speak a little bit more to how masculinity and identity is tied with gambling today, seemingly in a positive way. What challenge does this introduce to regulation? Is it new, or is masculinity and gambling just becoming entangled in new ways because of the tech that's facilitating it?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'm fascinated by this as well, and I know Steve and Julia Cook's book, recent paper explores this.
Yeah.
Um,
Barry actually worked on that too.
Oh, sorry, Barry. Thanks. Apologies. Thanks, Barry. Yeah, I'd come back to the this issue around the injunction to be a kind of speculative financial subject, but also to bear the consequences of when that goes wrong. I mean, I'm fascinated by the way in which this relationship between gambling and investment, not so much that it's that the threshold is becoming unclear, but that we're expected to be highly risky investors in our own lives at all times, and to mobilize the resources around us to speculate on future actions and how much that is tied up with ideas of being perfect masculine subjects. Yeah, I find it extraordinary, and as you can hear a lot, a lot of this is anecdotal. I can't stress enough how important in the social media landscape that's targeted at young men, the idea of sort of being offensive and combining that with highly risky speculation and gaining a following through being offensive, that those things are tied up. I feel like we're developing a set of subjectivities oriented around high risk speculation that we just don't understand at all.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, to give a plug to the research we're doing in our center at the moment, we'll have a seminar on this later in the year that we're getting some really interesting data about kind of different modes of speculation and how they relate to masculinity and different use of different types of fintech, and the way that things like crypto and shares are increasingly kind of enrolled in kind of a gambling subjectivity. So we'll be able to kind of maybe shed some light on that later in the year as well. We got a question from Alex. Some of the potential ways to deal with this are being mooted. Things like mandatory limits, that is making it so that it's basically impossible to gamble beyond affordable levels. Mandatory limits also mean that staff don't have discretion or tension. Once the limit is reached, that's it. Other ideas include minimizing the dream element, removing huge wins and sharing smaller wins more widely. If these things were to come in, to what extent do you think they might address some of these issues that you're seeing?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Alex, because as I've sort of explained at the moment, once a customer goes beyond the limit, the expectation is that the staff member is going to intervene. So there was a tribunal case for unfair dismissal where the manager was successful actually in claiming unfair dismissal because he'd been dismissed because he failed to do that. But on the basis, the unfair dismissal claim, sorry, I'm going off topic slightly, but was successful on the basis of how difficult that would have been within the circumstances. So, and maybe you can explain more, Alex, but what information would be financial information would be required to make that determination? And my question is that what I'm orienting us around is which interventions are going to be meaningful in people's lives. I'm endlessly fascinated by people recounting the intervention, in peer-to-peer groups, recounting the interventions that have been meaningful for them. And it's what I want to do is as we start to bring in some of these more data-based methods in the UK, how effective they are at actually getting people into recovery or treatment or peer-to-peer support. But yeah, could you say a bit more, Alex?
Yeah, so a few years ago, our team, led by Neroli Hing, did some work on talking to venue staff here. And I think I shared it with you when we were talking
Okay.
before. That it specifically got to that question, like, getting staff to intervene. And it's really fraught, because a lot of staff don't feel like it's their job to do that, like it's a moral decision for them, not to sort of step in and tell people what to do, even though they're sort of meant to. But also around, a person's gambling is kind of like you don't know what level is appropriate for a person because you don't have, like you said, you don't have access to that information. So an alternate approach is to work out a level that everyone can get to, and that's it, no more. So it's the equivalent of sort of, once you've had too many drinks, you cut off for the night, and how many drinks that would be. Um, uh, so there is some work on what's called low risk limits, like how much people can lose in a session or a day or whatever before they start experiencing harm. Like for most people, trying to work out whether to place those limits is tricky. But the point would be, if you're going to use a machine or bet online or whatever, you can only bet up to $20 or $50 or whatever it might be. And then that's it. You're done for the day. You can't bet anymore. And so the staff don't have discretion about cutting someone off. It's just that's the limit.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of talk about potentially bringing those in, and taking this onus off staff because it is potentially a bit unfair to expect staff to be able to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it puts the onus on operators to be thinking about the way products are structured and where is the scenario in which losing beyond this amount is a responsible business practice. But
Well,
absolutely.
I don't think it's the businesses. I think it would be regulators. The idea would be that it would be set across everyone.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, it would need to, I mean, that's the key. It would need to be joined up between operators
Mhm.
and between formats.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. Anything that takes it's the situation at the moment is that, as I say, that the pressure and responsibility is placed on staff, which isn't so, in a way it's fairly useful because there's no injunction or there's no kind of pressure on thinking about how products are structured.
Hmm.
Okay, so to finish off, I might ask one more
Yeah.
question to you, Sam, from I know, and then I'll maybe get you all just to kind of quickly comment on a question about maybe what we need to see happen in the future. But the first question for you, Sam, is the concept of hope is so interesting as a driver for gambling, which we come across all the time in our research with socioeconomically disadvantaged communities and individuals. You touched upon this a little bit, but how could we harness that and replace the hope with something that is not gambling for people who have very little hope otherwise? Love to hear your thoughts about this or chat about later. It's a tricky question.
Yeah. I mean, I've got it here that obviously, as we know, for so often it's not hope at all. It's a routinized practice that may have started in hope, as Aino says, but becomes a kind of something and I've got obviously the Lauren Ballant, something you're attached to because maybe at one point it did provide that hope, and now it's a kind of you're staying within the orbit of the one thing that did provide you
Hmm.
an image of a life beyond this one. I mean, in a way, it's more stark with relation to crime, with say drug dealing, where there is no wage labor is never going to offer you in this current context the income to provide the consumer goods or the night out, that's going to give you an image that this relationship or this life is actually worth it. And drug dealing can give you that immediately. And that comes up again and again, that people do drug dealing not for the money, they do it for the speed of the money and the fact that it offers an experience beyond the current rhythms of life. How can we harness it? I come back to my, a decent and secure welfare benefit system that offers a life that's actually a meaningful life rather than a deliberate destitution. Proper and come back to the strength of unions and employment rights that offer conditions and paid labor that actually again offers you to be able to believe that you're a good parent or a good partner.
Yeah. I know. Do you have something to say about hope?
Sorry, I feel like it's like I mean, we've looked at it also in different welfare systems. So obviously Australia is similar to Australia, and then Finland, where I'm originally from, where the welfare systems were more generous. Like it's the similar something about it. And like I'm trying to delve into that kind of how can we flip that around? But I think you're absolutely right. It's structural, and like if you've got such a punitive and cruel system for these people who need and are entitled for better benefits. It's like it's almost like banging your head against the wall almost. So yeah, don't know where to start, but there's something in terms of like doing something about it. Like there's an intervention point in my head that I haven't quite captured yet, but would love to chat more some other time.
Okay, so it's just maybe just to finish off, if I can ask you a kind of, like a hopeful question in a way. Um, in the future, if there was one thing that needs to change or you could implement in, next in this area to kind of make things better, what would it be? You want to go first, Anna?
Yes, happy to. I mean, where do I start?
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, in terms of what I was talking about, and I think this pins into it, we need a let's think about tobacco regulation and smoking, for example. I feel like with gambling, we are where tobacco was 30 years ago. And even with we now have the evidence of doing something better. And I'm talking about kind of government forces, regulatory action, but also like hearing the human voice in it. And we are sophisticated now enough. Like evolution has done its tricks, but and I think it all intertwines kind of with the system that we're part of, but also kind of how other systems like the gambling industry is what's the word, utilizing the lack of action.
yep,
And I think if we could somehow delve into that, well, I'm not going to say we need more research, but we need some national, like strong leadership, some,
yep.
advocacy around it. And like I think we are getting there, but we're very behind in terms of doing things that we know that are right as a society.
Yeah, for most social problems, we have the research and we know how to fix things. It's just having people willing with the political kind of will to implement them, right? Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah. Alex?
Yeah, I think um, when you look at gambling, like Arno kind of said it well, we're behind other products in a way, but
Hmm.
there's also this idea that we still sort of hark back to this idea that people are going to make rational decisions in an irrational environment, like with all this stuff around them that's urging them to bet more, bet often, all this kind of thing.
Mm.
Um, and there's a lot of people in this space who are really trying to make meaningful change in the right directions, but it's very hard to do. We see a lot of small changes happen, and the big stuff is constantly kicked down the road.
Yep.
So uh, it's going to sound bad, and it's going to sound like I don't like, I'm the cranky man in the room now and stuff. But we have meaningful limits on most other behaviors. If you want to borrow a lot of money, someone's going to stop you doing it. If you want to drink a lot of alcohol, your body's going to stop you doing it for starters. There are limits on how fast we can drive. If you don't drive with a seatbelt, you get in trouble. There are all these limits in our lives, and yet with gambling, you can still gamble as much as you want, anytime you want. Even with money that's not yours. So meaningful limits and restrictions that are not discretionary, that are not up to operators to decide,
Yep.
is the obvious place to go.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks. Makes a lot of sense. Sam, do you want to have the final word?
Yeah, I mean, building on those, that recognizing that there is no need at all to have the advertising landscape that we have. This is not normal or necessary or in any way acceptable. And if it means not losing sports entirely, but losing funding on a small scale, it's worth it. This isn't a normal state of affairs. Or an acceptable state of affairs for advertising to be so ubiquitous and destructive.
Yeah. Excellent. So thanks for all of your papers today. I really appreciate it. We'll hold it there, and yeah, thanks again for educating us on such an interesting topic. Cheers.
Thanks for organizing, Steve.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Steve.
Nice to see you all. Bye-bye.